Hello, everyone. I'm Ari Povich, and welcome to this special week of A Current Affair here in Hollywood, land of fantasy and dreams. But there's a sinister underside here, too. Behind me, Laurel Canyon, where many of the stars seek their privacy. But it's also the scene of the most sensational crime since the Manson Massacre. Our David Lee Miller follows this nightmare, which is still unfolding, the Laurel Canyon murders.
What the Los Angeles police saw inside this house on the afternoon of July the 1st, 1981, made even the most hardened detectives shudder.
It looked as if someone had walked through the house with buckets of blood and just threw the buckets of blood everywhere, and that's pretty close. There's a lot of blood.
Inside a scene of stark terror. 4 bodies, 2 women and 2 men, brutally beaten, their heads bashed in. A 5th victim found in a pool of blood barely survived, but couldn't remember, much less describe what she'd seen. One thing was certain. This orgy of violence was not the handiwork of a single man. The detectives knew that, but they didn't know it was a case that would eventually touch the lives of Liberace's lover, an adult film star, John Holmes. They also didn't know it would take nearly 9 years to bring the man they believed ordered the killing to trial.
The trail of broken lives that lies behind Mr. Nash has to end, and this has to end, and this has to be resolved. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm asking you to return guilty verdicts in this case, because all of the evidence has shown that he, in fact, is guilty.
With those words, the prosecution rested its case late last week against this man, reputed drug kingpin Adel Nasrallah, known as Eddie Nash.
Ed Nash, 1981, was a businessman in Los Angeles. He owned nightclubs. He was a good target. He had drugs. He had cash.
He also had a motive for murder. Prosecutors say Nash ordered the Wonderland Massacre because he'd been robbed by some of the victims less than 2 days earlier.
And he sent his thugs over there like a terrorist raid. And they went into the house, and ladies and gentlemen, they proceeded to bludgeon and bash in the brains of every individual who was in that house.
While the defense claims Nash was framed, both sides agree on one thing, that the robbery that led to the killings was planned in this house by a group of desperate drug addicts and thieves, known as the Wonderland Gang. But not all the victims in the house that night belonged to the gang. There was Barbara Richardson, a girlfriend of one of the robbers, who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Susan Lanius, who was there to try and patch up a broken marriage. They would suffer the tragic consequences of a desperate scheme hatched by one of the most celebrated stars in the world of adult films.
Hi, I'm John Holmes. Pretty impressive, isn't it?
Back in 1981, John Holmes wasn't impressive at all. Gone were the days when he made $3,000 a day in X-rated films. Gone with a sly smile and slick moves, the fancy clothes and ready cash. Everything gone. The only thing left was his insatiable appetite for drugs. Drugs he usually got, but couldn't always pay for, from his friends at Wonderland, like David Lind. On the witness stand, Lind claimed a broke and desperate John Holmes offered to settle his drug debt to the Wonderland Gang by setting up a robbery at the home of one of Hollywood's richest drug lords, Eddie Nash.
Now, you mentioned there was a plan made in which John Holmes would go over to that house and leave a door unlocked. Is that correct?
That was the plan from the beginning. It never changed.
In an interview last year, Lynn graphically described what happened when Nash refused to open his safe.
I asked Nash for the combination and/or keys. He was rather reluctant to give me that information. So therefore, I took the pistol I had in my hand, stuck it into his groin, and then removed it and stuck it in his mouth, and cocked it. And I told him I wanted the information, or they're going to blow his head off. And then I jerked it out of his mouth in a very ungentle manner and put it between his eyes. And then he started to tell me what I wanted to know.
This case is a case of revenge. It's a case of a man's ego that couldn't stand for what happened. He couldn't allow this to happen in the circles that he moves. That man was unmanned and humiliated by this, and he was going to get even.
According to police, Eddie Nash declared war on the Wonderland Gang. They had taken more than $500,000 in drugs, jewelry, and cash. violated his home, and threatened his family. And here in Hollywood, you don't mess with Eddie Nash. He has money, power, and friends in high places. But he is best known for his drugs, which is why 2 days after the robbery, another young man came knocking on his door, a man named Scott Thorson.
We had homes all over the world. I mean, we had a mansion in Hollywood. We had a penthouse in Los Angeles.
Scott Thorson was Liberace's young sidekick and live-in lover until they had a falling out over drugs and Eddie Nash. But in July of 1981, Thorson was still driving Liberace, at least on stage. Off stage, he had an $1,800 a day cocaine habit, and sometimes he'd sneak away during the shows and head straight for the one place he knew he could get drugs, the home of Eddie Nash.
Cocaine was not that easy to find, especially in some of these cities where I didn't have any connections. So a lot of times I would sneak away and I'd lease a Learjet.
When you arrived at Mr. Nash's house that time, the day that Holmes was brought in, did you learn there was some problem with the drug deal you'd set up?
I learned that Mr. Nash had been robbed, and he was extremely angry that he was robbed, and that I would have to wait.
As Thorson waited impatiently inside the big house, he says he saw Nash's bodyguard, Greg Dials, a 300-pound bruiser, push John Holmes into Eddie Nash's room.
I heard Mr. Nash threatening Mr. Holmes, telling Mr. Holmes that he would have every member in his family killed. And John was begging for his life. I heard furniture being, like a body being knocked around on walls.
Did you hear Mr. Nash order Mr. Dials to do something else at that time?
Yes, he ordered Mr. Dials to take Mr. Holmes up the street to Wonderland Avenue to get back his drugs and money.
What happened next here at this home on Wonderland Avenue, we do not know for sure. But police believe Holmes was taken here at gunpoint, knocked on the door, and was let in, and then forced to participate in at least one of the murders so that he too would be implicated in the crime.
There's evidence that we have of Holmes's palm print, left palm print, face down on the bed frame or the headboard, one of the beds over one of the victims. And it was my belief, and that I did argue, that he actually participated in one of the killings.
In December of 1982, John Holmes was arrested in Miami and charged with the Laurel Canyon Massacre. He refused to testify at his trial, and the only victim who survived, Susan Lanius, couldn't identify Holmes in court, saying she only remembered her assailants as shadows. After 3 days of deliberations, the jury came back with a verdict.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, John Curtis Holmes, not guilty of murder.
On March 13, 1988, John Holmes died of AIDS. Shortly after his death, his wife told a current affair about a conversation with her husband she will never forget.
We started with the shaking and the crying, and he says, I do have to tell you because I can't live with this by myself.
According to Sharon, John Holmes admitted he'd taken the killers to Wonderland Avenue that night, but denied he'd taken part in the massacre.
I said, Don, how could you? And he said they were dirt. And I said, John, you knew these people. And he said they were dirt and they were stupid.
In the fall of 1988, 6 months after John Holmes died, Eddie Nash and his bodyguard, Greg Dials, were charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Prosecutors say the charges were filed after Scott Thorson came forward with new testimony linking Holmes and Nash. But the defenses argued that Thorson, along with most witnesses in the case, can't be trusted because of his past.
Your client murdered those people, had those people murdered. I heard it, I saw it, I saw Mr. Dials and Mr. Holmes, and there isn't anything you can do and say that I'm lying now. That man is a murderer, right there.
But Nash could still walk free. In a case where the only evidence is circumstantial, the jury must now decide his fate, based primarily on the testimony of liars, drug users, and thieves.
And I'm going to ask you, that's what I know you're doing. That is that you want to do what's right, you want to do what the law says you should do, and you want a verdict you can be proud of, and one that you can live with, and not be worried that a week from now or a month from now Somebody can walk through the door of a courtroom and say, oh yeah, by the way, I did it.
Last week, the jury began deliberating the fate of Eddie Nash. A second jury, meanwhile, continues hearing testimony in the trial of his bodyguard, Greg Dial. Both men could be sent to the gas chamber if convicted.
You know, there's a lot more stories like this in Hollywood. Hundreds, thousands, hell, maybe even millions. Kind of makes you wonder what's going on this very minute in any one of those stories.
Despite a lengthy and a massive investigation, both police and prosecutors say there are other suspects and there might be other trials before the book is finally closed on the Laurel Canyon murders.
David Lee, when you take a look at the families, have they followed this after all these years, or are they withdrawn?
You know, it's been nearly a decade, and you never forget the loss of a child. I talked with some people who lost a daughter in that home up in Sacramento, and they are very closely following the court case, and you better believe they will not rest easy until this is resolved.
Thank you very much, David Lee Miller.